This is the story of 9 men who were given everything and became nothing. It is a tragedy if you are generous. It is a horror if you are honest. And it is true, every word of it, which is perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. I will ask only one thing of you. Do not look away. Not when it becomes dark, not when it becomes sad. These things happened, and they deserve to be witnessed in full. The world was younger then. Understand what that means. Not merely that the years were fewer, but that the world itself was rawer, less settled, still ringing faintly with the music that had shaped it at the beginning of all things. Mountains that now are worn and grey were sharp and bright and arrogant against the sky. Forests covered continents. Rivers ran clean from sources no living eye has seen in 10,000 years. The stars, on a clear night, were not mere lights, they were presences. The sky was alive in a way it no longer is, and those who lived beneath it knew it, and felt it, and sometimes feared it. This was the second age of the world, the age of the rings. The great enemy, the first Dark Lord, Morgoth, who had poisoned the world from its very birth and warred against the light for age upon age, had at last been overthrown. Thrown down and cast out beyond the walls of the world, into a void from which there is no return. The war against him had cost everything. The land of the elder days, Beleriand, vast and beautiful, and full of the greatest kingdoms the elves had ever raised, had been swallowed by the sea. The cost of victory had been the very ground on which it was won.
But the world continued. The survivors rebuilt. The elves who remained in Middle-earth established their havens. The race of men, still young in the long count of years, spread across the recovered lands and built their own kingdoms. And there was peace. Not perfect peace, for there is no such thing, but something close enough that generations were born and died without ever knowing war. And Sauron waited.
He had been Morgoth's greatest servant, not a man, not an elf, but something older and stranger, a Maya, one of the spirit beings who had entered the world at its shaping and taken form within it. He had served evil so long and so completely that the memory of what he had been before the service was like a dream of another life. He was not as powerful as Morgoth had been. No one and nothing was, or ever would be again. But he was subtle in ways that raw power is not.
Morgoth had destroyed with his fists, with his very presence, with the sheer, overwhelming corruption of a being who had unmade himself in the act of unmaking everything around him. Sauron was more patient, more elegant, more dangerous in some ways, precisely because of what he lacked. He waited through the first centuries of the Second Age, gathering himself in the East, rebuilding his strength in secret. And then, when enough time had passed that the sharpest memories of the elder days had softened, when the new world had grown comfortable in its peace and its prosperity, he moved. He did not come as a conqueror. not yet. He came as a friend. He called himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. He was beautiful. Understand that. Whatever form Sauron chose in this age, when he still had the power and the will to choose, it was arresting, gracious, luminous with apparent wisdom. He came to the elven smiths of Eregion, the greatest craftsmen in all of Middle-earth, the inheritors of a tradition of making that stretched back to the very first ages of the world. He came as a teacher, a collaborator, a fellow lover of craft and beauty.
And the elven smiths, their lord Celebrimbor above all, listened.
They were not fools. They were among the wisest and most skilled beings in the world. But wisdom and skill are not the same as suspicion, and Sauron had been deceiving greater minds than theirs for longer than their civilization had existed. Together they made the Rings of Power. It was brilliant work, the greatest feat of smithcraft the world had ever seen, or would ever see again. The rings were not mere ornaments, not simple tools. They were vessels of power, each one tuned to amplify and extend the will and the nature of the one who wore it. Sauron guided the process, shaped the philosophy of their making, whispered the principles into receptive ears, and throughout it all, the long spider patience of him, the way he watched and waited and planned, while appearing merely to collaborate, was something so perfectly concealed that not one of the elven smiths suspected what was truly being built.
And then he left them. He went back to Mordor, to the mountain men called Orodruin, the Fire Mountain, the Crack of Doom. There, in the deep places of the earth, where the rock itself was liquid and the heat was the heat of the world's own core, he forged one final ring. He forged it alone. He poured into it his own power, his own will, his own essence, more of himself than any such vessel had ever been asked to hold. He made it the master, the ruler, the one. And when he put it on his finger for the first time,
and reached out through it to all the other rings that had been made in his shadow, the elven smiths heard him. They felt his will pressing through the metal they wore, reaching for them, claiming them. They tore their rings off. They had understood too late what had been done. But the rings for men were already given. Now here is where the story becomes intimate. Here is where it becomes sad.
There was a time, long before the darkness took them, when they were men. Not ordinary men, but the greatest among mortal kind in the twilight of the second age of Middle-earth, kings of renown, sorcerers of terrible learning, warriors whose names were spoken with reverence from the coasts of Numenor to the furthest reaches of the eastern lands. They walked in sunlight, they built kingdoms, they loved power and glory as great men are wont to do, and it was that love, that reaching, grasping, entirely human love, that made them perfect instruments for Sauron, the Dark Lord, lieutenant of the fallen Valar Morgoth. They were not weak men. They were not foolish men. They were not men who reached for power from smallness of soul or poverty of spirit. The ones who mattered, the nine,
were the greatest of their kind in all the world.
And that is the particular, refined cruelty of what was done to them. Sauron chose the best, because only the best would last long enough to become what he needed them to be. And because there is a specific kind of darkness in the corruption of greatness that the corruption of mediocrity can never achieve.
Think about who they were.
3 of them were great lords of Númenórean descent, and if that name means little to you, let me make it mean something. Númenor was the gift given to men at the end of the Elder Days, an island raised from the sea as reward for their faithfulness in the wars against Morgoth. Its people were given longer life than ordinary men, greater height, greater strength, greater wisdom. They built the mightiest ships the world has ever known.
They established colonies along the coasts of Middle-earth that became great cities. Their kings could remember, in youth, the sight of the immortal elves in their first glory. They were, in the count of mortal men, as close to magnificence as mortality allows.
3 of those who received the 9 rings were heirs to that tradition, lords of consequence and gravity, men whose names were known across the width of the world, men who had built things and fought things and endured things that would have broken ordinary souls like kindling. They were not naive about power. They had wielded it, been shaped by it, understood its texture and its cost. They received the rings with open eyes, or what they believed were open eyes.
One was an Easterling, a great lord from the peoples of Rhûn, the lands far to the east, where the sun rises, and the world has its own entirely separate texture of history and culture and war. His name in the records of that time is not preserved, but he would later be known as Khamûl, and he would be second only to the greatest of the 9 in power and in proximity to Sauron's will. He was a king of men who already knew something about dominion, about the long labor of holding territory against enemies on all sides. A ring of power must have seemed to him like the logical extension of everything he had already spent his life building. The others, the remaining 5, their origins are not recorded in any surviving account with certainty. They were kings, sorcerers, warriors. They came from the corners of the world. They were real men with real names and real histories and real faces that the people around them loved or feared. And all of that, every particular, every story, every relationship and memory and scar, was going to be slowly consumed and lost until nothing remained. They wore the rings.
And at first, it was everything they had hoped for. The power that moved through a ring of power is not the blunt force of a sword or the raw potency of a spell. It is more like a tide, or like the way light fills a room when the shutters are opened, pervasive, immediate, transforming the quality of everything without appearing to do anything specific. They grew in influence. Decisions they made carried further, settled faster, were more readily obeyed.
The kingdoms around them bent toward them the way plants bend toward light, not through force, but through a kind of gravitational inevitability. They became centers around which events organized themselves.
And the life was the most seductive part. Other men their age were beginning to slow. Other men their age were feeling the first stiffness in the joints, the first threads of grey at the temple, the first quiet intimations of the body's eventual exhaustion. The 9 felt none of it. They remained. They stayed precisely as they were, strong, vital, commanding, while the world around them aged and turned and aged again. The children of men who had known them grew old and died. The grandchildren of those children grew old and died.
The 9 remained. The buildings around them were rebuilt. Kingdoms that had been young when they first put on the rings matured and declined. The 9 remained. They moved through time like ships moving through water, cutting through it, leaving a wake, but fundamentally unchanged by the passage. It was the fulfillment of every mortal dream. It was the answer to every desperate prayer that has ever been whispered in the dark by someone who knew they were running out of time. And it was eating them alive. This is the part that deserves the most attention, the part that people hurry past because it is uncomfortable, not with the clean discomfort of violence or horror, but with the murkier, more personal discomfort of recognition. They did not become wraiths overnight. There was no single moment of transformation, no catastrophic rupture between the men they had been and the things they became. It happened the way all the worst changes happen, gradually, incrementally, with long stretches in which nothing seemed to be changing at all, and then a moment of clarity in which you look back and realize that everything is already different and has been for longer than you knew. The rings were connected to the One, always, from the moment Sauron put the Master Ring on his finger and reached through it. The 9, worn by living men in the living world, were not merely rings of power. They were threads in a web, with Sauron at the center, and every year the threads grew a little shorter, pulled a little tighter, drew the wearers a little closer to the center, without their quite noticing the motion. The first sign was vision. They began to see things others could not see. Shadows had texture they had not had before. Darkness was not opaque, but translucent. And through it, dimly at first, then with increasing clarity, they perceived another world layered beneath the visible one. A world of shapes and presences that ordinary eyes could not access. This felt at first like a gift. Like the power of the ring was opening their perception, expanding their senses, making them more rather than less. They did not immediately understand that what they were seeing was not a fuller version of the world, but a different one. The Wraith world, the shadow layer of existence, where the living and the dead blur together, and the distinction between them is negotiable. The second sign was touch. Things that had felt solid began to feel, sometimes, slightly less so. Not always, not dramatically, but there were moments when they reached for something and their grip was not quite what it should have been. Moments when their own hands looked, in certain lights, slightly translucent.
Moments when something in the physical world around them seemed to be refusing to fully acknowledge their presence, as if the world of solid things was beginning very slowly to reclassify them.
The third sign was memory. Not that they forgot, they remembered everything. But memory began to feel different. The earlier years, the years before the rings, began to feel like stories they had been told, rather than things they had lived. Faces they had loved became abstractions. Feelings they had once felt with the full force of a living body became the idea of feelings. They knew they had felt these things. They could describe them accurately, but the capacity to actually feel them was attenuating, retreating, like a tide going out. They still commanded. They still ruled. They still fought and planned and moved through the world of men with terrible effectiveness. From the outside, watching them, you would have seen powerful and imposing figures at the height of their authority. It was only from the inside, only if you could somehow stand in the increasingly cold and shadowed space behind their eyes, that you would have understood what was happening to them. They were becoming hollow.
The will and purpose that remained in them, that directed their actions, that made them formidable, was increasingly not their own. Sauron's will, flowing through the One Ring and out through the Nine, filled the space that their own wills vacated as they faded. It was not, at first, experienced as control. It was experienced as certainty. They always knew what to do. They always knew what to want.
Decisions that might have been difficult when they were fully themselves were now straightforward, obvious, immediate. They mistook the simplicity for wisdom for a long time. By the time the simplicity was recognizable as something else, as the narrowing of a mind down to a single point, as the replacement of their own complex, many-faceted, entirely human desires with one cold and perfect directive from a will that was not theirs, it was too late. It had been too late for centuries.
One by one, sooner or later, each of them crossed whatever invisible threshold exists between a living man who has been corrupted and a wraith who was once a man. The crossing point is nowhere recorded. Perhaps there was no single crossing point. Perhaps it was simply a gradient, shading from living to unliving, the way twilight shades into dark, with no precise moment you can point to and say, here, exactly here, is where the day ended. They became the Nazgûl.
You need to understand what you are dealing with.
Close your eyes for a moment. No, keep them open, actually. Keep them open and imagine this instead. Imagine that you are standing in a road at dusk, and far down the road, still distant but approaching, you see a shape, a rider, tall, extraordinarily tall, the way tall things are when they are wrong tall rather than simply large. Seated on a horse that is also too large, too dark, moving with the absolute silence that is the opposite of natural silence, the silence of a thing that should be making sound and is not. You watch it. You wait for it. Something in you knows before thought can organize itself into words. that you should not be watching it. Something very old and very quiet in the back of your chest is telling you to move, to go, to be somewhere, anywhere else. But your legs are not taking instruction from that part of you. Your legs are doing nothing, and the rider is coming closer. Now imagine 9 of them, all at once, from different directions.
This is what the Nazgûl were in their physical presence in the world of men. 9 figures robed entirely in black, not the ordinary black of dyed fabric, but a black that seemed to absorb the light around it rather than merely reflect darkness. The robes were full length, trailing, with deep cowled hoods that pooled shadow even in open daylight. They were tall beyond the measure of most men, 7 feet, 8 feet, something in that register. And within the robes was nothing that the eye of a living person could quite resolve into a face, or hands, or any of the features by which we recognize a fellow being. Look directly at the space where a face should be, and you would find not a face, but an absence, a shape of darkness that refused to cohere.
And yet they were not immaterial. This is the crucial, terrifying distinction. They were not ghosts in the sense of things you could walk through, or that existed only as light or suggestion. They were physically present. They had weight. They had impact. Their footsteps had sound. Their swords, and they carried swords, long and cold, were real metal that drew real blood. They breathed. You could hear it if they were close enough, and what you heard was not the rhythm of a living creature drawing in air to sustain itself, but something slower and colder and wrong, like breathing heard through a wall of stone.
It was what they breathed out that was perhaps the worst of it. Every exhale carried with it what survivors called the black breath. Not a poison in the simple chemical sense, but a spiritual contamination.
To breathe the air around a Nazgûl too long, to be too close to one for too long, was to begin to fall under a wasting influence that manifested as deepening despair, growing confusion, a feeling that the world was becoming grey and pointless, and that all effort was futile, and all hope was self-deception.
People who escaped a close encounter with the Nazgûl and were not otherwise physically harmed could spend days, weeks, unable to rise from their beds, unable to eat, staring at nothing, while the cold certainty of hopelessness settled over them like a second skin. In the worst cases, in those who had been held near the Nine for extended periods, the black breath could kill, not dramatically, not with gore, but quietly, like a lamp running out of oil. Their cries deserve particular attention. In the Wraith world, the shadow layer they half inhabited, their voices were something very different from the measured, contemptuous speech the Witch-king occasionally used in the physical world. When the Nazgûl cried out in pursuit or in warning, or in the particular shriek of something that senses the proximity of the One Ring, that sound crossed between both worlds simultaneously,
It was not a sound the ear heard exactly, or not only the ear.
It was a sound the blood heard, the bones, the place at the base of the throat where fear lives. People who heard it at full volume, at full proximity, were known to be found unable to speak, unable to move, simply standing with the sound still echoing through them hours later, the way a bell goes on ringing long after the strike.
Their horses in the early period, before the fell beasts, were black stallions of tremendous size, bred specifically for them, creatures that had been exposed long enough to their rider's presence that they had been changed by it.
Horses are sensitive to things humans are not, and these animals had been shaped by years of proximity to wraiths into something no longer entirely natural. They were fast, they were powerful, they were absolutely silent in their movement, and they were without fear, because the kind of animal that could be broken by exposure to a Nazgûl would not have survived the breaking in.
And what remained afterwards was something that had moved beyond the reach of terror into a territory where only service remained.
When they rode together, when all 9 moved as a formation, the effect on the countryside around them was immediate and visible. Birds fell silent. Animals fled without apparent cause for minutes before the 9 arrived. The air temperature dropped. The quality of light shifted in some way that was difficult to describe, but impossible not to notice. A slight dimming, a loss of warmth, as if the sun was working slightly harder than usual just to maintain its own presence in the sky.
They could see things that living eyes could not. The ring, wherever the ring was visible to them as a presence, a source of their own master's power, a blazing beacon in the wraith world that they could sense across distances ordinary perception could not compass. This is what made them such effective hunters. You cannot hide the One Ring from the Nazgûl Homong, because the One Ring is more visible to them than any physical landmark. It pulses, it calls. It resonates with the 9 rings they carry within their own corrupted forms, a resonance like a tuning fork struck and held near a matching string.
The Morgul blade was their most refined instrument of subjugation. Where an ordinary sword kills, the Morgul blade converts. It was a thin, pale dagger, not ornate, not especially impressive in appearance, in the terrible way that only instruments of corrupted will can be alive, purposeful, patient, directed. It worked inward through the body towards the heart, and if it reached it, the wound's victim would undergo a transformation, not into a Nazgûl themselves exactly, but into a lesser wraith, a servant of the 9, stripped of self and will and fully subject to their lord's command.
This is what was done to Frodo on Weathertop. But I am getting ahead of the story.
With the One Ring made and the 9 fully bound to it, the Nazgûl was Sauron's most powerful instruments of war during the last centuries of the Second Age. They were his generals, his enforcers, his assassins, and his ambassadors of terror. Where they rode, kingdoms did not merely fall. Kingdoms became questions without answers, populations suddenly aware that everything they had built,
could be reduced to nothing in an hour. But the Second Age ended badly for Sauron.
The last alliance of elves and men, two of the greatest peoples of the world joining their strength in a final desperate reckoning, enduring, fighting, dying, in the fire and ash, under the shadow of the Black Land, sustained by the desperate knowledge that if this broke, there was nothing left behind them worth fighting back to. And in the end, Sauron himself came out. The battle on the slopes of Orodwin that followed was the most terrible single combat in the history of the world to that point. Gil-galad, greatest of the elven kings who remained in Middle-earth, died. Elendil, the lord of the Númenórean exiles who had rebuilt their civilization in the wreckage of a sunken island, died. The cost was incomprehensible, but Sauron fell.
His body was broken, his spirit expelled from it, and in the chaos of the moment, Elendil dead, his son Isildur standing over the ruin, Isildur took the hilt shard of his father's great sword, and with it cut the one ring from Sauron's hand. With the ring severed from its maker, the Nine lost their sustenance. They had not carried within themselves all this time any power of their own, only Sauron's power, routed through the One Ring and out through the Nine Rings and into them. Without that flow, they collapsed. Not destroyed. They could not be destroyed while the One Ring still existed, and Isildur had foolishly kept it, rather than destroying it in the fires where it had been made, but dispersed, dissolved, reduced to less than shadow. They retreated to whatever place wraiths go when the power animating them is withdrawn, and there they waited, dormant and patient, for the world to turn. This waiting was not nothing. Do not imagine it as sleep or unconsciousness. They were still, they persisted, but without the current of the One Ring to give them shape and purpose and full presence in the world, they existed in a state of extreme diminishment, a thing with no will of its own, waiting for the will that owns it to return. The cruelty of this, the particular sadness of this, is almost beyond articulation. They had long since ceased to be capable of suffering in the human sense, but the state itself, the pure fact of it, is terrible. 9 beings who had once been kings, who had once commanded the reverence of nations, existing for centuries as little more than the memory of a darkness, waiting for their master to recover enough to need them again.
The Third Age was the age of the Nazgûl's great and terrible second chapter.
As Sauron's power slowly rebuilt itself, gathering in Dol Guldur in the greenwood that would eventually be renamed Mirkwood, pretending to be a lesser shadow while he recovered the strength to step back into the light, the 9 gradually re-emerged. They came back one by one over the long centuries, pulling themselves back into the world as the current of the One Ring, still far and faint but strengthening, began again to reach them. The one who came back first and most fully was their lord.
He had no name now. Whatever name he had carried in the Second Age as a king of men had been lost, not recorded in any account, not spoken in any surviving tale. He was the Witch-king, and he was the most terrible single entity in the physical world of Middle-earth. Look at him. You need to look at him.
He was enormous. 9 feet, some accounts suggest. Though height matters less than presence, and his presence was the kind that does not require height to dominate a room, a road, a battlefield. He wore black robes, heavier and more elaborate than the others of the Nine. Over them, a cloak of shadow that moved with a life slightly independent of the wind, as if it responded to the wraith world in addition to the physical one. He wore a crown. An iron crown. Not the elegant worked metal crown of a living king, but something older, cruder, more deliberate. A crown that declared sovereignty the way a brand declares ownership, blunt and undeniable.
It sat atop the darkness where his face should have been, which was perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. A crown worn by nothing, sitting atop an absence, the symbol of rulership floating over a void.
His sword was longer than those of the others, and colder. The cold of it radiated in a small, visible area around the blade in the night air, the way water radiates warmth in winter.
He rode a horse so large and so completely transformed by his proximity over long centuries that calling it a horse felt like a category error. It was a horse the way a deep ocean creature is technically a fish, in that it shared the structural origins without sharing anything else that might make the word comfortable. His voice, when he used it, was the voice of an authority so old and so absolute that it operated on the body before the mind could process the words. People who heard him speak in anger reported that the sound entered through the chest rather than the ear, a vibration at the frequency of very old fear, the kind of fear that predates language and lives beneath thought. He was the most powerful wraith in the world. He had been, once, the greatest king among those who received the 9 rings. The descent from one to the other, from that to this, was so vast that looking at it directly was like looking at the sun. You had to approach it sideways, or it would overwhelm the capacity to process it. In the year 1300 of the Third Age, he established Angmar. Angmar, a kingdom in the cold northern waste beyond the ancient realm of Rudau. A kingdom that existed for precisely one purpose: to destroy what remained of the Númenórean kingdoms in the north, Arnor, which had already fractured into 3 successor states, barely holding their own weight, and to do it thoroughly enough that nothing would remain as a seed for future resistance. He was brilliant at it. This is the part that history sometimes glosses over, because it is easier to think of him as a force of nature than as a strategist. And he was both, but he was the strategy first. He used the fractures. He found the fault lines in the 3 kingdoms of Arnor, Arthedain, Rudar, Cardalon, and he pressed on them with the patience of centuries. He turned Rudar. He isolated Cardalon. He brought plague to the Barrow Downs in the south. He was not in a hurry. He did not need to be. The Witch-king of Angmar had time, the way a mountain has time, in quantities that made the urgency of mortal men look like the brief, bright flash of a struck match. One by one, the northern kingdoms bled out. In 1409, he struck the great watchtower of Amon-Sul, Weathertop, and burned it. The king of Arthedain died in its defense. The scene stone that had sat at its summit, a palantir,
one of the great communication stones of Elendil's people, was saved, barely, and carried in desperate retreat.
Decades passed. Generations of the dwindling Dunedain lived and died in diminishing territory, while the Witch King's cold certainty pressed from the north. In 1974, he broke Fornost, the last city of Arthedain. The last king fled. The Northern Kingdom, the last living remnant of Elendil's legacy in that part of the world, was extinguished. 700 years it had held, dwindling and retreating, and holding and retreating, and now it was gone. The Witch King rode through the ruins. He had accomplished what he had been sent to accomplish. The North was broken. And then the defeat he had not planned for.
In 1975, the armies of Gondor came, too late to save Arthedain, but not too late to answer it. Prince Eärnor sailed north with a great fleet, and the remaining forces of the north, the last rangers, the elves from Rivendell, what could be gathered, met him. They caught the Witch King's retreating force. The Battle of Fornost was devastating and decisive. The armies of Angmar were broken and scattered. The Witch King fled.
And as he fled, the great elf lord Glorfindel, one of the brightest of the remaining Eldar in Middle-earth, a being of such age and power that his presence on a battlefield changed the quality of the light around him, looked after the retreating shadow with something ancient and certain in his eyes, and spoke these words: "Do not pursue him. He will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man shall he fall."
A prophecy, spoken in the smoke and the cold air of a field of dead men. Words that would not be understood for over 1,000 years. The Witch King went south. The Nine were reunited, and together they turned their attention to Gondor.
Minas Ithil was their target, the Tower of the Moon, Gondor's great fortress on the western border of Mordor, built in the shadow of the Mountains of Shadow by Elendil's son Isildur in the early days of the Third Age. It was a beautiful city, built with a Númenórean genius for stone that produced buildings of such precise elegance that they seemed grown rather than constructed. White towers, terraced gardens, a great silver dome that caught the moonlight and threw it back against the surrounding mountains.
They besieged it in the year 2000. It fell in 2002. What happened to its beauty afterward is the transformation you need to hold in your mind to understand what the Nazgûl were capable of, because they did not simply occupy Minas Ithil, they transformed it, not by tearing it down and rebuilding it, but by simply inhabiting it, by moving through its streets and towers for years and decades and centuries, until the stone itself seemed to change quality.
They renamed it Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery. The gardens died, not cut down, simply dead, as if the will to live had been removed from the roots. The white of the towers did not go grey or brown the way neglected buildings do. It went the pale of old bone, of things that were once alive and are no longer, and the moonlight it reflected shifted in color from silver to a sick, cold, greenish luminescence that lit the valley it occupied, Imlad Morgul, the Valley of Living Death, with a glow that travelers on the high road above could see from miles away, and that none of them ever wanted to see closer.
The air in the valley was bad in the same way the black breath was bad, not immediately dangerous to those merely passing near it, but carrying something in it that the body registered and recoiled from, a subterranean unease that settled into the bones and stayed there.
Flowers grew on the valley floor, pale, waxy, odorless flowers that bloomed without sunlight by the light of Minas Morgul itself. And those flowers had the same quality as everything else in that valley, the form of a living thing, with the essential fact of life subtracted from it.
Here the Nine kept their court. Here they planned. Here they waited for the centuries of the Third Age that remained. For the moment, their master's power was sufficient to send them out on the task for which they had always ultimately existed, finding the ring. The year 3018 of the Third Age arrived, and the Nine were dispatched.
Before the black horses thundered north, and the shadow of Nine fell across the peaceful roads of a world that had spent the last millennium mostly forgetting what fear truly was, there was a moment, unknown, unwitnessed, unrecorded, except in the fact of what followed. The Witch-king received his orders.
The Nine gathered at the gates of Minas Morgul in the hour before dawn. 9 enormous black figures on 9 vast black horses in a valley that glowed its sick, pale green around them. And for a moment, just a moment, they were all in the same place at the same time, still, before the pursuit began.
What was in that moment is impossible to say. They had no interior life left in any human sense. They had no reflections, no second thoughts, no lingering trace of the men they had been, looking back at them from the inside of their own darkness.
And yet, there must have been something, even if only the thing that remains when everything else is gone. The bare fact of existence, the cold and hollow knowledge of what they were and what they had been. The ninefold silence of 9 former kings preparing to ride out in service of a will that was not theirs.
If there was anything like grief in them, it was not grief they could feel. They were beyond feeling anything that had not been permitted to them by the One Ring. They rode. And I want you to understand what that meant for the world they rode through. The Nazgûl, moving across the landscape of Middle-earth in their 9-fold formation, were not merely 9 dangerous individuals on horseback. They were a weather event, in the emotional sense.
They passed through the Shire lands, through that gentle, domestic, absurdly peaceful corner of the world where small people grew crops and told stories and worried about nothing more serious than the harvest. And in their wake, even before the hobbits knew to worry, animals fled and birds fell silent, and the air went a degree colder, and something instinctive in every living creature within miles said, "Wrong, wrong, this is wrong."
They were looking for a name and a place. Baggins, the Shire. Sauron had learned enough from the creature Gollum to know both. And the Nine spread out across the land in patterns of search, following every thread, closing every gap, tightening the net with the slow certainty of beings that did not tire, did not sleep, did not reconsider.
Khamûl came to the door of Bag End itself. This is the detail that sits in the throat. The second most powerful ringwraith in the world, on horseback, in the lane outside a hobbit hole, speaking to an old gardener who had no idea what was standing 10 feet from him. Khamûl asked for Baggins. He was told the family had moved. He lingered. Something about the place held him. The ring had been here recently.
The traces of its presence resonated with him, the way a smell resonates with a hunting animal. Not information exactly, but direction, urgency, heat.
Frodo Baggins was already gone, though not far enough.
The pursuit that followed across the wilderness was the Nine at their most terrible and most relentless. They scoured the land, they interrogated, they killed where they needed to, and frightened where killing was not yet useful. The hobbits, Frodo and his 3 companions, had the benefit of guides and the occasional wild luck that appears sometimes in desperate situations, and they reached the ancient hill of Amon Sul, Weathertop, ahead of the Nine, but not by enough.
The ruins of the watchtower on that hill had a particular history with the Witch-king. He had burned them 600 years before. He had been here in force, in triumph, in the hour of Arthedain's dying. Now he came back. The night on Weathertop is the moment everything in the hunt became concrete and personal and irreversible.
5 of the 9 came out of the darkness at once. 5 enormous black shapes moving with the absolute silence of things that are not quite fully present in the physical world, coming down the hillside towards the small hollow where the hobbits had their fire. The fire sputtered when they approached. The darkness around them was deeper than the darkness around it, the darkness of things that consume light rather than merely blocking it.
The Witch-king led. You would know him even in that company. He was taller, his presence more crushing, the darkness around him more complete. He carried in his hand not his longsword, but the Morgul blade, that slim, purposeful dagger, pale as old bone, made for one specific horrible purpose. Frodo, in the paralysis of that confrontation, in the extremity of the terror that the black breath generated simply by proximity, did the only thing he could think to do. He put on the ring. And what he saw then was the truth of them.
The dark world, the wraith world, revealed everything the physical world concealed. The black robes did not disappear, but became less important, because beneath them, in that other light, the 9 were visible as they truly were. Grey robes, white hair streaming,
Tall, regal shapes with the bearing of the kings they had been, but faces that had the quality of very old stone, not the living stone of mountain or cliff, but the stone of things cut and placed and abandoned and worn by weather long past the point where any human hand tends them. Their eyes were the only color in them, pale fires, burning cold, the color of hatred that has become so old and so complete that it has passed through emotion into something more like a physical property, the way extreme cold eventually becomes indistinguishable from extreme heat in what it does to living tissue. The Witch King's crown blazed with cold white fire in the wraith world. Beneath it, his face, to the extent that the word applies, was the face of a being for whom the concept of mercy had been entirely forgotten, not in the way of cruelty, but in the way of something so far removed from the possibility of mercy that the word simply did not exist in the vocabulary of his remaining consciousness. He drove the Morgul blade into Frodo's shoulder.
And Frodo, small, half-paralyzed, terrified beyond any functional capacity for heroism, found something in himself that should not have survived the ring's presence and the nine's proximity. He found a name, a holy name, the name of a power of the world's making, the Lady Elbereth, who set the stars in the sky, and he cried it out. And he found his blade, the short sword from the Barrow-Wight's hoard that had been made by men of Westerners for use against exactly this kind of enemy, and he drove it into the Witch King's foot. The blade dissolved. Blades struck against the Nazgûl dissolve. They cannot maintain their material integrity against something that is barely material itself. But the strike was not nothing. The Witch King drew back. There was a shriek, not from his mouth, or not only from his mouth, but from the wraith world, from the collision of a living will calling on powers older than Sauron, and a dead will serving powers made of exactly the stuff that older power opposed. The nine retreated into the dark. Frodo lay with the splinter of the Morgul blade already working inward towards his heart. What followed was a desperate race, the remaining distance to Rivendell, to the healing that the elves could offer, measured against the speed at which the splinter was moving, and the speed at which the nine could close the distance again. The bearer of the ring was now marked in the wraith world as clearly as a torch in an unlit cave. Every moment the nine could sense him, and every moment the distance closed. The ford of Bruinen, the Loudwater, where the road to Rivendell crosses the river on the borders of Elrond's hidden valley, was the place where the full nine came together for the final push. 10 days after Weathertop, with Frodo barely conscious and the splinter still working its patient path, the nine gathered at the riverbank and demanded what they had come for. They crossed into the water, 9 of them, mightiest servants of the greatest Dark Lord in the history of the world, confident in their power, their numbers, their absolute dominion over the fear of living things. And the river rose. Elrond, Lord of Rivendell, had called upon it, had spoken to the waters that ran through his valley, and asked them for what waters are sometimes capable of giving, when asked correctly and with sufficient authority. Gandalf, on the far bank, added his voice, and the Loudwater answered. It rose in a roaring wave, not an ordinary flood,
but a flood that had been called with purpose, and in the memory of what these shores meant and what crossed them.
The wave had shapes in it, white shapes like riders on white horses, and it broke over the Nine with the force of everything that opposed the shadow. The Nine was swept away. Their horses, those great, terrible, shadow-bred animals, were drowned in the cold water. The Ringwraiths themselves were unhorsed, scattered, their physical form in the mortal world disrupted by the deliberate, purposeful violence of water, wielded in opposition to everything they represented.
They lost the chase. They lost their mounts. Their power was diminished, not ended but reduced. Their presence in the physical world made less immediate, less solid. For the duration of the events that followed, the Great Council in Rivendell, where 9 representatives of the free peoples of Middle-earth pledged to carry the ring to Mordor and destroy it, the Nazgûl were absent. They were never absent for long. When they returned to the war, when they re-emerged with full force into the events that were driving towards the end of the Third Age, they came on something that was not horses. They came on fell beasts.
What were fell beasts? This is a question with an unsatisfying answer, which is to say an honest answer. The lore does not name their origin, does not tell us what they were before the Nazgûl rode them, or whether they had existed before in any form. What the lore does describe, with terrible precision, is what they looked like.
They were vast. Their wingspan was enormous, greater than any bird that has ever lived, greater than the largest eagles of the free peoples, greater than anything that should fly. But they were not birds. They were not dragons. They were not any known category. They were naked of feather and of scale. Their hides were bare and grey-black and dull, stretched over a framework of bone that was visible in places, the gaunt architecture of something designed for a world with different rules.
Their wings were not feathered pinions, but membranes, vast, thin, webbed between long horned finger bones that extended from the main structure of the wing, the way a bat's wing is structured, but immeasurably larger and more wrong-feeling in its proportions. Their heads were long, their beaks or jaws were long and pale, their eyes were yellow, not the gold yellow of a hawk or the warm amber of a domestic animal, the yellow of old fever, of bad light, of illumination that reveals nothing and obscures everything that should be visible.
They were silent in flight. A creature with that wingspan should have produced sound. The massive displacement of air by those membrane wings should have announced itself from a mile away. They did not. They came out of cloud cover and darkness in the same silence that characterized everything about their riders, the silence that was worse than sound because it denied you the warning that sound carries.
When the 9 rode them, 9 enormous black-robed wraiths on 9 enormous wrong-winged creatures, the formation they made against a sky was a sight that the language of ordinary things is not quite adequate to describe. It was the image of absolute dominion. It was the visual fact of a power that had moved beyond the need to make concessions to anyone or anything.
Their shrieks, the fell beast's own cries, were distinct from the Nazgûl's own voices. though in the combined chaos of a battlefield encounter between a mounted ringwraith on a fell beast and whatever opposed them, separating one from the other was not something anyone was particularly positioned to do.
The beast screamed like metal failing under load, like something enormous tearing, and the sound did what all sounds connected to the Nazgûl did. It reached somewhere below conscious thought and pressed on something very old and very deep.
The Pelennor Fields, the year 3019 of the Third Age, the 15th of March.
Everything that the Nazgûl had done for 3,000 years, every kingdom destroyed, every people terrorized, every life taken or hollowed or broken, had been preparation, consciously or not, for this. The Witch-king had been given the command of the assault on Minas Tirith, the White City, the last great fortress of the free peoples of the West. If it fell, there was nothing behind it. Gondor was the last wall, and if Gondor broke, the darkness would not stop. He led the assault in full form. He came to the gates of the city on his fell beast, surrounded by the forces of Mordor, innumerable, vast, the full terrible weight of everything Sauron had built and gathered over the long centuries.
And he came to the great gate itself, that enormous structure of iron and steel and ancient stone, built to withstand anything that the engineering of mortal men could conceive, and he raised his voice and his will against it. The gate did not crack, it did not chip or dent, or show the kind of incremental structural failure that you would expect from physical force. It simply broke, not from outside, but from within, as if the material will holding the stone and iron together in their purpose, the intention of defense, the idea of the gate as a gate, had been extracted. It fell open, shattered. The Witch-king rode through in the silence that followed.
There are many things that can make silence, but the silence that followed the breaking of the gate of Minas Tirith was the silence of a world trying to absorb the evidence of its own ending. The defenders on the walls above stood without moving. The soldiers at the gate's inner defenses stood without moving. Something had just happened that should not have been possible, and the gap between what was and what should be was too wide to cross quickly. Gandalf stood in the city. He alone did not fall still. He met the Witch-king in the ruined arch of the shattered gate, on his white horse Shadowfax, and for a moment that seemed larger than moments usually are, two ancient things looking at each other across the space that had once been a gate, neither moved. The Witch-king spoke, cold and proud, absolute. He had all night, he suggested. Gandalf could stand aside, or he could die. Those were the options. There were no others. And then the horns of Rohan sounded from outside the walls. The Rohirrim had come. The cavalry of Rohan, thousands of riders, had arrived on the Pelennor, and their horn call was the sound of something that was not supposed to happen, happening anyway, and it changed everything in the calculation of that morning. the Witch-king turned his fell beast from the gate and rose into the sky to deal with what had changed. What he met on the field of the Pelennor was not what he expected to meet. He met a woman. Éowyn of Rohan had ridden to war in disguise, a woman among the warriors, hidden under helm and cloak, and the collective fiction that she was a young man of the Riddenmark. She had come because she refused, with every part of herself that still had the capacity to refuse anything, to be left behind when everything worth protecting was riding to its last stand. When the Witch-king's fell beast landed over the body of her fallen uncle and lord, Éowyn stood between them. She stood, alone, on foot, against the largest single concentration of malevolent power in the physical world, and told the Witch-king that he would not touch the fallen king. He laughed. If the absence that stood in the space beneath the iron crown was capable of laughter, it produced something in that vicinity. He told her that no living man could hinder him. He was quoting a fact. He was stating, with the cold certainty of 3,000 years of existence, what he was, what had been prophesied, what Glorfindel had seen in the smoke above the Battle of Fornost 1,000 years before. He was not wrong, but he was operating on a definition of the relevant terms that excluded crucial data. Mary Brandybuck, hobbit of the Shire, hidden behind Éowyn in the chaos of the field, drove a blade of Westerness, a blade from the Barrow-Wight's ancient hoard, made specifically by the men of the north in the wars against Angmar, into the Witch-king's leg from behind. The blade was made to be hostile to his nature. It had been made in hatred of what he was and what he had done to the kingdoms of the north. It struck, and it sundered something in him that went beyond the physical. And in the moment that the Witch-king's form reeled from what Mary's blade had done to it, Éowyn drove her own sword into the darkness beneath the iron crown. The cry that followed was not from the physical world, or not only from the physical world. It was the sound of something that had endured beyond all natural measure and beyond all mercy, finally reaching its end. The shriek of a will that was not its own, trying to hold together a form that had never truly been real, as the last pretense of cohesion failed. The Witch-king of Angmar, greatest of the Nine, lord of the Nazgûl, once the mightiest king of men to receive a ring of power, was gone.
Not scattered, not dispersed as he had been after the War of the Last Alliance, waiting to reconstitute when the ring called him back. Gone, undone, unmade in the specific way that things built of sorcery and stolen life are unmade, when the specific counter to their specific nature finds them at the right moment, in the right hands, with the right words in the air. The iron crown fell on the trampled grass of the Pelennor fields and lay there, empty.
The remaining 8 had been abroad, serving, commanding, hunting, fighting on every front that the war in its final terrible weeks required of them. They were present over Mordor, over the battlefields, riding their fell beasts across the sky in the service of the last great push of Sauron's ambition. And then, on the 25th of March in the year 3019,
on the edge of the crack of doom, inside the mountain of Orodruin, a creature called Gollum bit the ring from Frodo's finger and, in his wild and mad triumph, overbalanced and fell. He fell into the fire. The One Ring was destroyed. The 9 rings, carried within the corrupted forms of the 8 surviving Nazgûl, embedded in whatever they were now instead of having bodies, ceased to have power. There was nothing to sustain the connection. There was nothing to sustain the form. There was nothing to sustain any of it. They were seen, in that last moment, to move. Watching from the slopes of the mountains above Mordor, soldiers of the armies of the West saw the fell beasts wheel in the sky, saw their riders, those enormous black shapes that had been the terror of the age, turn together toward Mount Doom, as if drawn by something magnetic, something inescapable. They heard the cries that came down from that wheeling formation, cries that were different from the hunting shrieks and the battle screams that armies had learned to dread, because those previous sounds had been sounds of will and purpose and terrible intent. And what came down from the sky above Orodruin in those last seconds was something that had no will anymore and no purpose, something that was no longer even quite the ghost of what it had been. And then they fell into shadow, all 8 of them, gone between one breath and the next, between one heartbeat of the watching world and the next. The fell beasts fell, those great creatures, stripped of whatever had driven and sustained them, became simply enormous dead things plummeting from the sky in the rain of fire and ash that Orodruin produced in its rage at the ring's destruction. The sky that had been full of them was empty. The Nazgûl are gone from the world, gone completely, in the way that things built of corrupted power are gone when the power is gone, not merely absent, but no longer possible. The age that made them ended with the destruction of the One Ring, and the 4th age that followed was an age in which such things could not be made again. The forging of rings of power at that level of craft and intention was a thing of the 2nd age, and the 2nd age was over, and everything it had produced that was not made of natural material eventually fell, or faded, or wound down to silence.
But they leave marks on the world that outlast their presence in it. The valley of Imlad Morgul was purified after the war, the sick, pale glow of Minos Morgul extinguished, the towers pulled down, the valley left to heal at whatever pace a valley can heal from 1,000 years of wraith occupation. It was not a quick process. The land remembers what happened to it.
The barrow-white blades from the ancient hordes of Westerners, made in hatred of the Witch-king, were spent in the spending of him. Merry's blade dissolved after the stroke that broke the Witch-king's form. Weapons made for a purpose are sometimes consumed by the fulfillment of their purpose.
The black breath that had afflicted so many in the final year of the war faded, as its source faded. The men and women of Minas Tirith who had been brought low by proximity to the Nine were healed, slowly, over weeks, by the king's hand and the herb called kingsfoil that only a true heir of the old bloodline could fully activate. they recovered.
They remembered, some of them, what despair had felt like. The way it had pressed in from the outside, like weather, like a force rather than an emotion. And they did not forget that memory, because it was the kind of memory that teaches humility about the capabilities of the darkness. And in the evenings of the New Age, around fires in halls and in homes, in the voices of storytellers who carried this history forward through the years, there would sometimes be a moment of silence after the naming of the nine, after the recounting of what they were and what they did, and what they had been before they became it. A silence that was not quite comfortable, a silence in which everyone in the room was, briefly, aware of the same thing, that they had been men. That they had been great men. That the road from great man to wraith had been a road of small compromises and gradual surrenders, and the patient pressure of a will that had more time than they did, and fewer scruples than they ever imagined. That the road, in other words, had been perfectly ordinary in every step, just very, very long. There is a verse, old, short, carved into the ring itself, that speaks of them without naming them. It speaks of 9 for mortal men, doomed to die. Not doomed to fall in battle or doomed to fail, doomed to die. As if the death was always the point. As if the rings were never gifts at all, but bills, and the long, cold, endless centuries of the Nazgûl were merely the time between incurring the debt and paying it. They paid it. 9 kings, 9 rings, 3,000 years of darkness. And at the end of all of it, at the end of the fell beasts and the Morgul blade, and the breaking of the great gate, and the cold, terrible voice saying, "No living man may hinder me," an empty crown in the mud of the Pelennor, and 8 shadows dissolving in the fire and rain above a broken mountain. 9 for mortal men, doomed to die. They did. And now you know. Now you have looked at them fully, at what they were and what they became, and what was done to them in the space between. Blow out the candle, if you like. The dark tonight will feel different than it did an hour ago. That is how it should feel. That means you were listening.